So I'll only read the statement, but I also have kind of a contextualized letter in which the statement comes. So I'll just read the statement and then we'll go to Dr. Robbins, who will sign this statement. So here it goes. We acknowledge there exists a strong correlation between the current debt-based monetary system and climate change through multiple chains of causation, which have to be taken into account to find solutions. On top of that, we believe that a sovereign monetary system will allow substantial public investments required to steer global civilization from a carbon-based system to a green, equitable post-carbon age. This is the statement that we're working on, and this is where people can, maybe put their name to it. And put their toes in the waters of activism. With this, I will go now to Richard Robbins, Professor Robbins, and introduce him for the next segment. So I happened, and I didn't know for a while, to have studied in a sociology class where we assigned Dr. Robbins' textbook, Global Problems and the Culture of Capitalism. I had the 4th edition, but it's already the 7th edition, and it has been translated many, I think in 3 or 4 other languages. Maybe the Spanish group can think about that. It might have to be published or translated also in Spanish. One of the items that he did write with Tim DiMuzio, Debt as Power, has been published into Spanish, so that's available there. Also, I know that Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine is available in Spanish, as is the very hard to process study by Bichler and Nitzen, titled Capital as Power. Anyway, Professor Robbins is a distinguished teaching professor at the Department of Anthropology at SUNY in Plattsburgh. I'll show you one other book that he did with Tim DiMuzio, An Anthropology of Money. And Lucille apparently has used that also in one of her classes at Illinois State. And I'm very pleased to have Dr. Robbins here to talk. And let's get stay organized there. He will talk, or the title is Once in a Lifetime Opportunity, COVID-19 and the Economy. Dr. Robbins, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Govert. I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. And
did we get you?
I've got it, I think. There we are. Everybody got that?
Yep.
Yes.
Let me explain the title and the quote up here from Mark Lastry, the CEO of Avenue Capital Group. And he said, I know you're not supposed to say this, but it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. You're not going to see this again, where you've actually got an economy that's fine and you've got a Fed pumping trillions of dollars in. Of course, Lastry's talking about COVID-19, and he's taking really a not uncommon view of investors in looking for investment opportunities. And I want to focus on that, with my talk. And I want to point out that SARS-CoV-2 is really the first pandemic of the financialized age. Previous widespread disease outbreaks, such as the flu epidemic of 1918, or the plagues that struck early modern Europe or the Roman Empire, occurred in industrial or pre-industrial economies. And I want to try to show how that makes a huge difference in what we can expect post-COVID. And to get an idea of where we'll go as the pandemic slows, I think it requires exposing the trajectory of the financialized economy up until now. And just to give you a brief outline of my comments, first I want to define and provide the evidence for the financialization of the economy, which obviously bears, again, great relationship to our whole monetary system. Second, I want to pose what I think is the major dilemma, in fact, an existential crisis. Third, I'll outline the major threats to the rate of return on capital and examine the government policies that address these threats. Fourth, I want to briefly examine how these policies may influence the economy post-COVID. And finally, I want to examine the rationale for changes in monetary policy that may minimize the damage posed by finance and essentially expose the absurdity of our financial system. By financialization, I mean, and I'm quoting from Don Caleb, the process by which the reproduction of societies as a whole becomes ever more dependent on finance, credit, debt, and the logic of speculative money capital. A historical predicament in which the imperatives of finance increasingly capture and dictate the social and political forms that feed it. As evidence of financialization, one of the things that's happening is that wealth that has to realize a benchmark rate of return of 4 to 8% is growing almost exponentially. Global investment capital grew from 51 trillion in 1990 to some 350 trillion in 2020, a growth of some 250% adjusted for inflation. It's projected to reach 450 trillion by 2024. Secondly, you can see financialization in the divergence of the share in the United States of GDP captured by finance as opposed to labor. You'll see back in 1960, there was about a 30% difference in money captured by labor as opposed to finance. And of course, finance comprises far fewer individuals than labor is in the United States. That's now down to 10%. And actually just prior to the crash of 2008, money captured by finance in the form of dividends, interest, capital gains, and rents actually exceeded that captured by workers. And finally, the share of the US GDP going to the financial service industry grew from 2% in the mid-40s to almost 5% in 1980 to almost 8% in 2007, and has actually remained fairly steady since. The question, of course, is who's getting all of these assets that are being generated. This is a chart drawn from Edward Wolff's work that shows one, asset types, and two, the various percent of returns that are going to the top 1%, next 9%, and the bottom 90%. And it's split between 2010 to 2016. You can see from 2010 to 2016, the share going to the top 1% was 2016, it was 55.6%. The next 9%, as you can see, is getting from 7 down to 35. But the bottom 90% is getting in 2016 only 9.2% of all of the assets generated by investment instruments. Contrast that to the fact that they hold 72.4% of the debt to 6.7% of the debt held by the top 1%. I want to suggest also that finance has an existential crisis. And the crisis is trying to maintain the rate of return on capital in face of declining rates of economic growth. In a seminal paper, Dean Baker, Brad DeLong, and Paul Krugman worked out the mathematics of the relationship between the rate of return and economic growth, and they concluded, we see strong reasons to think that over the long run, rates of return on assets are correlated and causally connected with the rates of economic growth. Now, they provided, again, fairly elaborate mathematical models to demonstrate this. And by the way, this paper was produced in order to argue against taking U.S. Social Security and turning it and privatizing it so people could in effect invest it themselves. Their whole point is that equity will not keep up because of economic growth. To give you a long-term perspective of this relationship between economic growth and return on capital, it's a wonderful series, actually, of papers generated by Oscar Jordan and his associates on the rate of return of everything. And they took a look at 16 countries and traced the rate of return on capital from 1870 to 1915. I generated this from their data, which, by the way, is online and which is exhaustive. But you can see that from 1870 to 2015, the economy grew at a little over 3%, but the rate of return on capital was almost 6%. After 1950, the rate of growth was 3.25%. But again, rate of return on capital was, in this case, again, over 6%. And after 1980, and you can see here we're dealing with the age of neoliberalism, economic growth declined to 2.48%, but rate of return on capital almost reached 7%. It's a mystery how this has happened because, again, if you look at rates of economic growth here from 1961 to 1990, both US and global, you can see it was a little over 4%, and it has reached 3%. And the mystery is how. How can the rate of return be, in effect, increasing as economic growth decreases? Thomas Piketty, of course, dealt a lot with this in his book, Capital in the 21st Century. His whole book, in fact, was based on the fact that rate of return always exceeds economic growth. He doesn't really talk about how that's done. He does, however, also project future economic growth at about 1.5%, which is not far from wealth advisors. Now, one thing is often overlooked when people talk about economic growth is the fact that it's exponential. And to give you an idea of this chart here, it shows you what exponential growth, of course, looks like. Give you an example, in the 18 years between 1999 and 2017, the automobile industry globally increased automobile production by 4.1 million cars. That's a 2.8% annual growth rate. If that same 2.8% growth rate was maintained for the next 18 years, they would need to produce 58 million more cars. And extrapolate this into resource production, into consumption. I mean, essentially, we all have to consume more this year than last year and more next year in perpetuity. And the rate of increase has to be at least, if you believe economists, 3%. I mean, in fact, we'd be hitting $2 quadrillion by the end of this century in terms of, again, what we would have to, the rate at which we would have to grow. Now, the question, of course, is how? How is this happening? That is, how are wealth managers managing to essentially challenge mathematical laws by having the rate of return to the money that they control increasing while growth is decreasing? And I want to suggest to you it has to do with the power of finance to control economic policy. To show you just some ways they do this, of course, they financially support politicians and through lobbyists and have unbridled access to legislative policymakers. And the presidential campaign in 2020 in the United States, 95% of the political donations were made by the top 1%, wealth holders and income. They supply the finance ministers who dictate economic policy. Of the last 13 secretaries of Treasury in the US, 7 came from Wall Street banks. 3, by the way, from what's his name? Goldman Sachs. 3 or 4 others were CEOs, others were wealth managers. There's only one who was not directly involved with wealth management, and that was a lawyer. It was under Jimmy Carter. In England, by the way, they usually come from the Bank of England. France and Germany, interestingly, finance ministers tend to be politicians, which is maybe why their economic policies are a little bit more progressive. They also share common interests with propaganda pushing media moguls, and they finance, of course, local and sovereign governments. Governments are dependent upon these investors to buy their debt with which they, in effect, run countries. Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page did a couple of works, interestingly, that examine the policies favored by the great majority of citizens in the US and those actually enacted by elected officials. They conclude that policy making is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans. And that when they say a majority of citizens disagrees with economic elites and or with organized interests, they generally lose. Moreover, because of the strong status quo bias built into the US political system, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor policy change, they generally do not get it. I put this chart together to show you the gauntlet that investment income, now, as I said, about $300 trillion, has to run to get to a decent rate of return. They have the threat of inflation. They have the threat of taxation, a threat of labor costs, threat of liability, threat of declining investment options, threat of competition, threat of default. And at the end, they hope to make at least a 6 to 8 return on investments. And the question is, how do they do that? That is, what help do they in fact get from government, which I say has a very vested interest in their success? How do they arrange policy to get that done? And I just want to run through some of the threats and, again, what in effect is happening. Obviously, the control of inflation is number one. Again, 6% return on capital with 6% inflation is nothing. And so that tends to be the primary concern of central banks. By the way, the US central bank is, I believe, the only major central bank that has a dual charter to control inflation or price increases and full employment. Rarely follow second. In fact, Jerome Powell, Secretary of the Fed, admitted as much in response to questions in Congress that, again, the United States workers lost millions of dollars in wages because they kept inflation rates too low. And of course, keeping money scarce is the way that's done. But generally, the government's very successful at been controlling this with a target rate of about 2%. They also ensure that the people who get the money don't spend it, which is likely to also put a limit on inflation. And this is simply the US velocity of money, M2 money stock, from 1959 to now, 2021. Some of this, of course, is due to the pandemic. But even before that, the velocity of money in the US was collapsing. By the way, it's pretty much the same in Europe, where the velocity of money is such that it's only spent a little more than once. Now, I have to ask, of course, where it's going. And again, a lot of it is going to people who don't need it and who consequently invest it. Fine, huh? Anyway, minimize taxes. Again, most of you know these figures. This is taxes for the US. As you can see, individual taxes remain pretty steady. Corporate taxes have plunged from highs of, in fact, at various points from 70 to 90%, down to today, which is, I think, about 22%. Corporate taxes globally also have constantly decreased. Another thing, the threat by wages. Labor costs go up, dividends go down. And so again, salaries have been kept low. This is simply a graph of labor share of non-farm income in the business sector, non-farm business sector. One way this is done, of course, is to minimize rate of union membership, which has in the US collapsed. Europe is a little bit better. And in some cases, particularly Germany, where you have workers on corporate boards. But that never happens, at least now, in the US. Same thing with job creation in the public sphere versus the private sphere. Private sphere going up, public sphere It's remained flat. Same with the US states, by the way. You minimize the regulation of externalities. And you can see here global deaths due to environmental causes. Of course, atmospheric carbon dioxide rates going up. You permit market concentration. Again, in the US, very weak enforcement of antitrust regulations. And here you can just see the increase in mergers. This, by the way, ignores another significant way in which this is done is through patent protection, which essentially is legalized monopoly. Thomas Philippon's book came out 2 years ago, The Great Reversal. And then he calculated that corporate mergers in the US, which by the way are much greater than in Europe, are costing the average American $300 a week. Of course, you also have the government doing the bidding of finance by creating investment opportunities. That's one of the great threats to finance. Where are they going to put the money to get it to grow? Of course, the competition for good rates of return also lowers rates of return, and that becomes another problem. But of course, governments have done very well in creating opportunities simply through debt. This is global debt in trillions up to 2018, 244 trillion. In June 2021, it was 297 trillion, approaching 300 trillion. And of course, debt is one of the most favored investment of investors because it's guaranteed theoretically. Again, US debt in billions, we're up over 80 trillion now in total debt. Here are three forms of debt. I want to see it, make sure you can see it. This is consumer debt in the US, revolving and non-revolving, outstanding mortgage debt, student debt. Debt, as again has been talked about endlessly at this conference, is, as I say, the most favored form of investment, either sovereign debt, corporate debt, or as you see here, household and consumer debt. And virtually all the other policies we've looked at to protect the rate of return, controlling inflation, lower taxes, slowing wage increases, ignoring negative externalities, and weakening antitrust legislation, all serve the need to increase borrowing. And I would say essentially US workers have had to borrow what should have been theirs in wages, and in addition pay interest on it. It's an ingenious system. And finally, what governments have to do is to prevent default. And it particularly applies to sovereign debt, which of course has increased enormously because of the pandemic. And this is simply the interest rates globally that are being paid by governments on sovereign debt. That's again between 5 and 9% over this period that could have been spent on other things by governments, but have to go to sovereign debt. Paula Chernyshev's study a while back to look at who best recovered after economic recessions. That is, how did the bottom 90% do relative to the top 10% in terms of recovery? You go back to 1949, 1953, you can see the bottom 90% did well. They recovered quickly, about 80%. The top 10%, 20%. And since that time, as you can see, the amount recovered by the top 10% has increased until in the collapse of 2008 and the period 2009 to 2012. Not only did the top 10% quickly gain back everything they lost, they actually gained an additional 15% of resources that could have gone to the bottom 90%. And I want to suggest to you that it's going to be far, far worse following COVID. The austerity programs that are going to be necessary to pay back the debt that's been injected into the economy, the lowering of taxes to maintain rates of return, the dealing with labor, not to mention the other social issues that are in the forefront now. racial justice, anti-colonial policies, and so on, will, I think, make it a lot worse. And I want to show you something that you may have seen. An interesting article in from the Brookings Institute today. Some of you may have heard that a couple of reporters at CNN pointed out that 2% of Elon Musk's wealth could solve world hunger. Musk, to his credit, replied. And he said, if the World Food Program can describe on this Twitter thread exactly how 6 billion will solve world hunger, I will sell Tesla stock right now and do it. Well, Homi Karas, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development, took up Musk's challenge. And he took 1% of the some 2,700 world billionaires. And he calculated how much they had and what 1% would be. And he calculated that these were how some of the global problems could be addressed just with that 1%, eradicating global extreme poverty, ending global hunger, conserving nature, protecting biodiversity, promoting inclusive policies, et cetera. Just to point out that our economy has gotten so incredibly out of whack that 1% of that wealth can go towards solving all these problems. Now, the only issue I have with Karas's exercise, which I think is ingenious, assuming a certain degree of altruism among the workers. And so just for the heck of it, I did some calculations. And I found that based on what he made in 2020, Jeff Bezos' yearly total income is greater than the military budget of India, the third largest in the world. Which to some extent, I think, brings us up short in terms of the amount of power that now lies in extreme wealth. Now, what I suggest is this raises a challenge for those of you here whose talks I've enjoyed. How does monetary policy factor into this? My own sense, having looked into money some with Tim DeMusio and some of our books, is that the greatest problem with money is that it's a store of value. And as if it's a store of value, you will always get people looking to make a positive rate of return. And you would get back to the same place. And I just suggest that as an interesting line of exploration to see whether or not we can ever get back to a decent economy. Now, we'll throw in one other thing that Govert was kind enough to mention, was Tim DeMusio and I done a book, Debt is Power. And one of the things we suggested is that the only way of really addressing this issue is through a debt strike. Because as much wealth as Jeff Bezos has, you have to understand most of that is in debt assets. He requires the constant stream of debt payments to actually have any wealth. And I would suggest that in the same way that labor gained some traction in the 19th and early 20th century through the debt strike, that's pretty much the only bargaining chip in control we have of the present situation getting much worse before it possibly gets better. So thank you very much. Jaro, in a few minutes over.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. If you like to unshare your screen, we can go into either speaker mode or gallery mode. I usually go into gallery mode. Dr. Robbins, yeah, thank you very much. I know you're very specific and handle statistics really in an imaginative way. And I hope if people can do a sociology class that uses your textbook to take it, because it's so enlightening to do that. Besides that, okay, let's talk monetary reform versus debt strike, or debt strike as a leverage point to get to monetary reform. What's your view on that? What is the?
Oh, no, my view, Govert, is that the debt strike has to be a way to get at monetary reform. I think, given the power that the power of finance with a capital F, and again, finance has more power than most states, so I think it deserves that status. But given the power of finance, that, frankly, I think is the only way to gain any leverage to really gain a serious consideration of major changes, such as a shift in the monetary system.
May I run this little ID then with you? I've been thinking about this issue since I read it in your book, and I thought that, let's say, if there is a group of people that will not be penalized for missing one mortgage payment, would all at the same time, as a political symbolic act, not do their payment, just to make the statement that there is power in numbers, but also that you know, it will scare the EBGBs maybe out of the powers that be, if that can be done. And so this is, you know, it's like a first step that doesn't get people into jail, or that we have to think about, you know, severe civil disobedience along the lines that Gandhi has developed and Martin Luther King. But something like that, would you see any virtue in that?
Let me explain just quickly, because Tim is going to be on next. First of all, it's not illegal. I mean, people miss debt payments all the time. At least about 10% of the population, you know, right now is in arrears. Probably, in fact, more because of COVID. Secondly, don't forget, a debt strike is not that much different than a capital strike. And capital strikes, that is, when banks withhold funds because they don't expect they're going to get their money, that's a strike, essentially. Third, and I have to thank Ted Cruz, the US Senator from Texas, who has attempted to organize debt strikes in Congress. Now, he's not calling it a debt strike, because if anybody called it that, he would immediately stop. But when he led a campaign, first, I think it was 2018, and then just actually still now, to not pay our US, to not raise the debt ceiling, essentially is a strike, because that money is already that unless you do what we want to do, we will withhold our debt payments. So it's already been legitimized by the United States government, essentially. It is not illegal. And again, you do need a critical mass, because once you get to, say, 20% of people withholding their monetary payments, and we recommended mostly in securitized debt, credit cards, student loans, by all means, mortgage debt, et cetera. If you can get 20%, there's nothing they can do, because they cannot, again, you know, repossess that many cars, that many houses, you know, et cetera. We saw that in 2007, 2008. Nor do they want to, because don't forget, the last thing they want to do is take a percentage of the population, say 20%, and remove their credit worthiness, because again, they've got to keep lending money. Otherwise, their whole enterprise doesn't work. So I think at some point, it's going to get to where I think the labor situation got. I'm sure when people talked about labor strikes in the mid 19th century, people said you can't do it. It took 50 to 100 years before labor managed to organize sufficiently to do that. And debtors, who I think are essentially the equivalent of what laborers were in the industrial economy, will have to do that. That's one of the things I think we've learned with finance.
Yeah, let's go on to a question. And Sue is the first in line, and then Jerry, and then probably we'll sec into Tim's presentation. Sue, go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Everything you said, I agreed with. And I want to just go back to a connection you made early on in your talk, that this pandemic, COVID-19,
Mhm.
is the first pandemic as part of such a huge financial economy. There have been other pandemics within the last 20 years, but they didn't go anywhere. They didn't go around the world.
Right.
And I just want to say something to that. I believe, and there's enough proof to show, that our financial powers are using this pandemic to change our monetary system in Europe, far as European central banks, and even trying in the US central bank, even though it's private, to use the pandemic to get central bank digital money under their control.
Mhm.
And I say that because, and this we discovered in the banking and have discussed in the banking committee of the Green Party since a member brought it up. September 2019, the repo market went crazy.
Mhm.
For the next 4 months, the New York Fed, over the course, because repo loans are short term, over the course of 4 months until the beginning of the pandemic, issued $7 trillion of repo loans
Mhm.
to financial institutions, banks, Wall Street, central banks. They had the system, they had to keep the system alive. And then COVID came. Great. Here's a way to put fear in everybody around the world and start to talk about central bank digital money through the current central banks, which they control.
Mhm.
And, I just want to say, and this has to go to Mary's request, there is so much censorship that Americans don't know that tens of thousands of fire workers, policemen, teachers are losing their jobs because of the vaccine mandates in this country and are protesting. They're fighting back. And so US is fighting back. But I want to ask you, is this, do you believe that the central bank digital money is being pushed by the bankers because they want to keep controlling our financial system?
Yes. No, I think a couple of people, mentioned, for example, the role of BlackRock, which is again a financial investment, a wealth control. And Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, in response to a prank by actually some friends of mine called the Yes Men, admitted that his job is to get a maximum rate of return for his clients, no matter what, no matter the environmental consequences, monetary consequences, or whatever. He was actually criticized, interestingly enough, by another wealth manager when he put out a statement saying he wanted to get more gender equity in BlackRock. And the other person, the other financial analyst said, you can't do that. That's not your money to play with. You can't make any social policy. You just got to maximize the rate of return. And that's where you got the idea of, again, the tyranny of the rate of return comes in. It can't stand. And again, COVID is very much the same.
Thank
All
you.
right. Jerry, are you there somewhere? If not, there you are, Jerry.
Yeah, I had no question.
Okay, I thought you had raised your hand.
No, I took it down.
Okay. Let's keep questions also from Franz for Tim's after Tim's presentation, because Richard and Tim are co-authors of some awesome books that I can recommend. Dr. Robbins, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Insights and the books that you wrote, and yeah, no, that textbook, I'll come back to it, that made a major impact. Through that textbook, I got to people like Immanuel Wallerstein or David Korten and a whole bunch of other insightful writers and researchers that have a really good grip on kind of the global scale of our problems. And in your textbook, you put the money problem kind of center. You start with the money problem and how that cascades through the system, through the economy, and creates all kinds of havoc to people and to the environment. So I can very much recommend, again, that textbook, because it also gives you a good sense of the complexity of what is going on and how things are feeding on each other, feedback on each other, and how it's quite tricky how to understand what is going on. So thank you again, Dr. Robbins.
If this video is helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe for new video notifications. Please consider donating at monetary.org/donate. Don't forget to check us out on Twitter at AMI Monetary or on our website